Hello, I'm Barry, and welcome to Rusty Nail and Friends, where children and grown-ups can enjoy a quiet story together. What could possibly make an entire garden party end with a tiny blue Wellington boot crashing through the shed window? How on earth did that happen? Let's find out, shall we? Welligig Blue flies in.
Nothing very exciting had happened recently. That is, until Morris Wainwright had decided to paint the shed bright blue, scaring off the jackdaws and deterring anything apart from the pigeons from settling on the roof. Even the spiders and earwigs refused to visit, complaining their feet kept getting stuck on the wet paint, which had run down the sides in stripes and gathered in great pools on the flagstones. Morris's wife thought it looked beautiful. "Just like the pavilion at Chelsea Flower Show," she pronounced, "except perhaps it needs a rose or something climbing over it." Morris soon threaded some piano wire through the staples he'd hammered into the lampboard, and the following day began tying the long thorny shoots of an Emily Grey rambler he'd collected from the garden centre. "How's that, dear?" he shouted, as his wife came from the kitchen to hang his football socks on the clothesline. "I think a window box would look nice," she replied, "and maybe one of those plastic weather vanes on the gable." Rusty Nail paced up and down the bench, wondering whatever Morris would be asked to do next, while young Pinion had his ear pressed to the window, eavesdropping on a couple of greenflies who had landed on the rambler and were arguing about who got there first. "Whatever is all that noise?" grumbled Posh Fernie, pushing open the lid to his box. "It's impossible for a feller to sleep these days." "It's Morris," began Sprocket. "He's fixing a window box, and I think he's going to plant some geraniums," he went on, pointing to a tray of plants balanced on top of the step-ladder. "They must be throwing a garden party, if you ask me," started Springaling, who was bouncing up and down excitedly from his hook in the roof, from where he could see Morris's wife digging weeds out of the lawn with a spoon. "It's just not like Morris to bother about making the garden look pretty." "A garden party," explained Wingsy, who was polishing the door knocker on the scrap-box. "Then it must be his birthday." "Or maybe he's won £1,000,000 on the lottery," said Rusty. "More like £10 on a horse, knowing his luck," grunted Posh. "Besides, he may not be having a garden party. He could have entered the best garden of the year competition." But that afternoon Morris strung some fairy lights from the barn door to the clothes prop at the end of the garden path, and fixed bunting around the kitchen window. "That proves it. He's having a garden party," exclaimed Rusty excitedly. "I wonder who he's going to invite. Somebody very important, I hope." Welligig Green, who hadn't bothered to say anything so far, just hung from his nail, shaking his head wearily. "Oh dear," he began. "Why ever do people always have to have parties? Birthday parties, Christmas parties, coming home and going away parties, housewarming and street parties, and now garden parties," he went on. "Parties, parties, parties." "Some of us enjoy parties," replied Sprocket. "Only if they get invited to them," said Posh Fernie, "and I doubt very much if Morris will invite us to his party." "Well, I'll be perfectly happy not to be invited," snapped Welligig, and with that he stuck his nose in the air and closed his eyes, as if to say, "I don't wish to talk about it any more." It was about 6 o'clock when Morris Wainwright staggered from the kitchen with an old trestle table which he erected on the lawn, while his wife began carrying out plates of sandwiches and cakes covered in coloured icing. Morris carefully placed the cups, saucers, and napkins around the table, together with some large plates decorated with big red roses, before standing back to admire them. "Somebody very important must be coming," exclaimed Sprocket. "Just look at those beautiful fairy cakes," he went on, licking his lips. "I think even you would enjoy this party, Welligig," he shouted. But Welligig refused to answer, or even open his eyes, pretending he was asleep. "Can you get that, dear?" shouted Morris, as he arranged the chairs. "Someone's just knocked on the front door. It must be them." Rusty Nail and the others gathered by the shed window, desperate to see who the very important person was, only to be disappointed when some untidy-looking children appeared, pushing and shoving each other as they fought to be the first into the garden, where they immediately started shouting and running around and around the pond, trampling down the pansies in the border. Now, children, it's not a flipping race-track," shouted a short, fat man who had just appeared. "Stop jumping about on Uncle Morris's flowers." "Oh, they're only youngsters," said Morris politely. "Don't shout at them." "That must be her brother," began Posh, who was staring over Rusty's shoulder. "He looks the spitting image of Morris's wife, even with that big red moustache," exclaimed Sprocket. "Then they must be her nephews and nieces." "What, all 6 of them?" screeched Rusty. "I counted 7, replied Wingsy. "See, on the fence over there," he said, pointing to a boy in a red football shirt balanced on top of Mr. Cullip's new large lap fence. "Off there, lad!" screamed the man. "It's not a flipping tight-rope." Whereupon the boy leapt into the vegetable plot, knocking over a large flower pot. "He's only a boy. We all like climbing on fences once," said Morris politely. "Don't shout at him." Morris's wife had now appeared at the kitchen door, and began manoeuvring a large wheel-chair down the steps. "Steady on!" screeched the buxom, red-faced woman with a plastered foot. "I'm not a piece of old luggage, you know." "Come and see the goldfish, Mum," shouted a big girl in red Wellingtons, who had jumped into the pond and was making waves with her boots. "Look, they think I'm a giant lobster." "Out of there!" screamed the man. "It's not the flipping seaside." Whereupon the girl clambered onto the rockery, knocking off one of the gnome's heads and snapping its fishing rod in half. "Oh, she's only a child," said Morris politely, but with slightly gritted teeth. "Don't shout at her." "Give me one of those sandwiches," shouted a little girl with a freckled nose and long plaits, chasing after her greedy little brother, who just snatched a plateful from the table. "Mum," she screamed, "tell him to stop." At that moment the boy tripped over Rupert the toddler, flinging the plate into the air and gazing in horror as the salmon sandwiches plunged into the marigold bed, and the pretty plate shattered into 1,000 pieces on the concrete path. "Nipwit!" screamed the man. "What do you think you are, a flipping juggler?" "Oh, he's still growing up," said Morris, after pausing and taking a deep breath. "Don't shout at him." "They're not very nice children, are they?" said Rusty quietly, turning to Sprocket. "Just normal kids," he replied. "But look at the parent," he went on, pointing to the lady in her wheelchair. "She's just eaten all the egg and cress sandwiches and grabbed a handful of fairy cakes." "What did I tell you about parties?" grunted Welligig, sounding a trifle pompous. "That's different," snapped Posh. "It's not parties, it's the people that get invited to them." If only we could do something before they completely destroy Morris's garden, said young Pinion, glancing up at Sprocket. Like making them all go home. Impossible, mumbled Welligig. People only leave parties when they've eaten everything and broken everything, and there's no more lemonade left to drink. Well, they have eaten everything, interrupted Springaling. See, those kids are licking the plates and trying to spin them around on top of Morris's beansticks. Oh, no, exclaimed Rusty, grabbing Sprocket's arm. I can't look, she went on, hearing the kids screaming with laughter as one plate after another fell off the stick and smashed as it hit the ground. Enough of all that nonsense, screamed the man. It's not a flipping circus. Whereupon the biggest boy shouted, I'm bored. Why can't we play football? Remember, they're only children, said Morris, obviously with some effort. Don't shout at them. Perhaps they'd like a nice game of croquet, said Morris's wife quietly, asking him to fetch the croquet set from the coal barn. But we will have to move the table off the lawn first, she went on, trying to sound positive. I'll just move your wheelchair to one side, Agnes dear, she continued, and free young Rupert, who appears to be trapped under the trestle. However, at that moment the toddler bounded away, tugging the trestle, still firmly hooked to his romper suit behind him, allowing the tabletop to drop like a stone onto Agnes's broken foot, sending a pile of plates and jugs of water cascading down the top into the poor woman's lap. Her husband gazed in horror as the crockery piled up into a huge cone below her chin, and a jug full of ice-cold water emptied itself down the front of the lady's dress. Flippin' heck, screamed the man. It's not a flippin' bowling alley, he screeched, snatching the astonished-looking Rupert from the ground. Aubrey, screeched the woman in a blood-curdling howl. Do something quick, you useless-looking balm cake. Morris, who had just returned with a bag of croquet hammers, had failed to notice the ice cubes slithering down the poor woman's leg, and calmly said, Oh, he's only a baby. Don't shout at him. Aubrey, however, had already sprinted across to his wife and was struggling to lift the heavy bench top from her foot, while shoving the wheelchair away with his boot, when suddenly it broke free, propelling the lady and the huge pile of crocks she was clutching at great speed towards the rock garden, where it stopped abruptly, catapulting Agnes and Morris Wainwright's crockery into the pond with an enormous splash. The kids burst into screams of laughter as their mother slowly came to the surface and clambered from the pool, wiping the muddy water from her face and fixing Aubrey with a horrible stare. He was only trying, whimpered Morris in a high-pitched voice, sounding as if he was about to burst into tears as he watched the last gnome being trampled into the mud. But before he could finish, the woman shrieked at the top of her voice, Shut up, nitwit! And gestured Molly May to give her one of her new blue Wellington boots. Then, hopping swiftly across the grass, she began slapping Aubrey about the head, screaming, You stupid great dimwit! Has it never occurred to you that you haven't got the brains you were born with? Yes, dear, gasped Aubrey, before dashing up the path to find sanctuary behind the garden shed. However, the woman had already hurled the boot after him with such force it bounced off his head like a rubber ball and smashed the shed window, knocking Sprocket and Posh Fernie off the ledge. Goodness gracious me, blurted Peter, picking up his stick. Whatever's going to happen next? I think the whole world's gone completely mad. Rusty was busy helping Sprocket to his feet and suggesting that they may be safer inside the scrap box, until the shouting died down. "But what about the boot?" said Welligig Green. "Boot? What boot?" replied Rusty. "The welly that broke the window, of course," repeated Welligig, sounding somewhat agitated. "Welligogs have feeling as well, you know." "Of course they do," exclaimed young Pinion, sensing that Welligig was a little upset about something. "Then we must find it." "She's hiding from that lot outside, probably underneath the bench, and who can blame her?" Welligig went on. "It can't be much fun being hurled through a window like that." "Certainly not," replied Posh apologetically. "And as you're so concerned, we must all start looking for her." Then turning to Wingsy, he said, "Wingsy, can you hear anyone moving about underneath the bench?" "I can hear a squeaking noise," blurted Springaling. "I think it's coming from that corner," he went on, pointing at a pile of old sacks. "Hush, Springaling, that's only a mouse," whispered Wingsy, putting his hand to his ear. "But there is a sound like somebody sobbing. It's very soft, and I think it's coming from behind those old paint tins on the floor." "What a shame," said Rusty. "She's probably terrified. We must find her at once." "Yes, come on, Welligig, jump down and help us look. I'm sure she'll be very pleased to see you." They quickly climbed down onto the floor. Sprocket and Pinion began by searching the flower pots, disturbing a very old spider by making huge holes in its web, while Wingsy walked around in circles with his hand first behind one ear and then the other. Rusty Nail clambered over the paint tins, peering into the dark spaces between them and calling, "Miss Welly, are you there?" while Posh Fernie sat on top of an oil can, tapping his stick on the floor, saying he could probably help best by working out the trajectory. Meanwhile, Springaling bounced over the apple boxes, asking the maggots if they'd seen a Wellington boot fly over recently. But in the end it was Welligig Green who discovered the little blue welly cowering behind the scrap box. He'd gone to ask the two-faced nut, who had a bad cold and had to keep blowing one of his noses, if he would help, when he heard a soft whimpering sound coming from behind the box and noticed a pretty little blue toe-cap. "Hello," said Welligig, peeping round the corner. "Are you the boot that came through the window just now?" "Yes, sir," replied the welly, choking back the tears, "and I never want to go back to those horrible people again." "Nor shall you," replied Welligig quietly. "Not if I've got anything to do with it." "What's your name?" began the two-faced nut, making sure it was the smiley face that was asking. "Or shall we just call you Welly?" "My real name is Welligig," she sobbed. "Welligig Blue." "That's a very pretty name," exclaimed the nut, "and it's my favourite colour." "Well, it's not mine," interrupted the sad face, sneezing into a large white hanky. "It reminds me of bluebells and hay fever." But before Welligig could tell him to stop being so miserable, Posh Fernie turned up and began tapping his stick on the scrap box. "Yes," he said thoughtfully, "that's about the spot I calculated she would land, give or take a foot or two." But Rusty and the others were more concerned about how she was feeling after being thrown through a window like that, and was there anything they could do, whereupon Welligig burst into floods of tears. "If only I could find a place to hide," she went on between large sobs. "Somewhere those nasty people can never find me." However, it was Morris Wainwright's raised voice coming through the broken window that alerted them to the real danger. "I've just about reached the end of my tether," he screamed hysterically, "so take your flipping coats and hats and boots and clear off before I fetch a policeman." "We certainly will, you uncouth, nasty little man," screeched the woman. "I never did understand what my poor sister saw in you in the first place." We must hurry, urged Rusty. They're sure to come looking for Welligig Blue any minute now. Fetch Molly May's Wellington now, Aubrey, ranted the woman. Then get me out of this madhouse. Molly May's Wellington, dear, he repeated. Where from? That old shed, of course, you nitwit, she screeched, pointing at the broken glass. Where else do you think it could be? Quick, Sprocket, shouted Springaling, who had just had a brainwave. Catch this! He threw down a tin of green spray paint he discovered on the top shelf. Welligig Blue, he went on excitedly. Close your eyes tight, and Sprocket will spray you green. Brilliant, shouted Rusty. And if Welligig Green will let you share his hook, they never will find you. A few moments later, the shed door swung open, and the man with the red moustache poked his head inside. What a ghastly place, he mumbled, before pushing Molly May in first. You know what you're looking for, dear. But search as she may, the girl could not find her blue welly anywhere. She noticed an old pair of green wellies hanging on a nail and some strange-looking broken toys thrown on the bench. But of her blue Wellington boot there was absolutely no sign. It was only when she kicked one of the flower pots and an angry-looking spider sprang out and stared at her that she suddenly decided she didn't really like blue wellies much anyway, and she'd ask her dad to buy her some red ones instead.
Thank you for spending a little time with us in the old garden shed. If you'd like to hear more adventures with Rusty Nail and her friends, we'd love you to subscribe. Until next time, sleep well and keep smiling.